And we are live. Welcome to the first ever Cape Town Press Club virtual event, having adapted to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's possible thanks to the generous support of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and we'd like to thank Christina Teichmann, our member, who helped facilitate this, and also our technical producer, which is Margriet Groenewald. It's a new experience for us, so it's going to take a little bit of getting used to. And I am, I'm getting some instructions being fed to me while busy speaking. We plan to have 12 of these seminars. The next one will be Professor Anton Harber on the 15th. We then have Herman Mashaba on the 22nd, and AGBA's chief economist, Wandile Siglobo, speaking to us on the 29th. But today, it's our pleasure to welcome Telita Snyckers, former customs lawyer who worked closely with Pravin Gordhan and Ivan Pillay at the South African Revenue Services. She holds a master's degree in constitutional law, as well as diplomas in exchange control and money laundering. And she was admitted as an attorney to the High Court. Could we please bring on Telita? Hello, Telita.
Hi, Brent. It's great talking to you today.
Great. Last time we spoke, we were in a crowded room drinking wine on the NASDAQ roof with lots and lots of people. And now I'm speaking to you from Singapore, where I think it's 6 p.m. where you are. And congratulations on your book, Dirty Tobacco, which was published by Tafelberg. It's available in all good bookstores. But more than just talking about the illicit tobacco situation in South Africa, you give us a global picture. And I wonder if you could just sketch for us, what is the scale of what you call big tobacco, and why do you call it big tobacco? Telita?
Yeah. Sorry, Brent. It seems like I'm hearing you twice. So, maybe, yeah, but I'll answer once. Right. So when we look at yes, can you hear me, Brent?
Yes, clearly.
Okay, good. Let's try again. So when we look at the scale of illicit tobacco in South Africa in particular, it's actually quite shocking. So, back in 2013, the illicit trade penetration rate in South Africa sat at 26%. And once SARS started really looking at illicit tobacco and making a concerted effort to clamp down on it, illicit trade penetration dropped to 14%. But since the investigative capacity at SARS was disbanded, we saw that illicit trade crept up to 35% in 2018. And as we speak today, of course, 100% of tobacco sales in the country would be illicit under the current ban. And what it means is that we are losing the equivalent of 66,000 policemen's salaries every year to unpaid tax on cigarette tax. So it's a phenomenal amount of money that we're losing. And the scale is simply staggering, not just in South Africa, but globally. And the reason why it's so big is because it's such a profitable business. So the Drug Enforcement Agency estimates that if you were to invest in heroin, you would make around 1,800% profit on your consignments. But if you invest in illicit tobacco, you stand to make as much as 4,200% profit on illicit tobacco. And so it is now the world's most widely smuggled legal product.
But you seem to say that the smuggling, it's not the illicit tobacco is not just a question of it being, illegal manufacturers. But I think you say in your book that something like 98% of the illicit tobacco trade comes from the big listed companies. How does that work?
Right. So what we know is that as much as 98% of all illicit tobacco comes from legal manufacturers that are licensed with the various tax administration agencies. And as much as 1/3 of tobacco exports go missing somewhere along the supply chain. And so the reason that happens is very simply because tobacco supply chains aren't regulated.
Now, why is that not regulated? Surely it would be an easy thing to have some kind of stamping device or some way to actually trace where the goods come from. I mean, I think you mentioned in your book, an automobile plant can trace every one of the thousands of little parts of a car right around the world. Why is this such an issue for the tobacco industry?
Well, so I think there are a number of reasons why the supply chains for tobacco are not being properly regulated. So, if you look at the supply chains for something like shampoo or a tube of toothpaste or even a punnet of tomatoes, those commodities are actually being traced through the supply chain to a far greater extent than a product like tobacco is. And a punnet of tomatoes isn't really susceptible to tax evasion, while cigarette consignments are highly susceptible to tax evasion. So we find that there certainly are solutions that would allow tobacco companies to trace their consignments through the supply chain. I think bottom line is that they choose not to do so for the simple reason that it serves their purposes to divert some of their product into the illicit supply chain. So what we see is that governments the world over are trying to introduce traceability measures so that, firstly, if we find packs on the market, we can actually trace them back to a particular tobacco manufacturer, so we know where the packs came from, and we can make sure that the packs end up where they were supposed to end up. And there are some countries that have introduced traceability requirements like this. But understandably, when you stand to make the kind of profits that you do from illicit tobacco, the tobacco industry has a very strong incentive not to have those regulations introduced and to fight against the introduction of those regulations. And what we see internationally and in South Africa is that the tobacco industry has government so beholden to it, and government so wary of actually taking on big tobacco in particular, that these traceability requirements simply don't get introduced. Sensible requirements like know your customer obligations or commensurate demand calculations are simply not introduced.
But it does seem, I mean, to the general public, and I know you explain it in your book, but it does seem to us as, as general citizens, there seems to be something counterintuitive, because surely illicit tobacco, which is then being sold at a lower price, would be a problem for the competition. And yet you say this is not actually the case. It doesn't increase competitiveness. In fact, there's no correlation between clamping down on illicit tobacco and profitability or market share. How does that work?
Well, so what we know is that whether you're a big tobacco manufacturer or a small tobacco manufacturer, you actually make the same amount of profit, whether you sell into the legal supply chain or into the illicit market. And so we know that for many of the big tobacco companies, they have traditionally and historically, the world over, managed to develop supply chains where much of their profit came from smuggling and from supplying the illicit market. So for instance, in China, We know that British American Tobacco made as much as 25% of their global profit from smuggling into China. And we know this because they actually documented their strategy, in quite great detail. And what this means is that when British American Tobacco at some point was considering entering into a joint venture in China, they actually walked away from it because a legal joint venture in China would have actually made them less profit than they were at that time making from smuggling into China. And so it becomes a very simple calculation. The amount of money you can make from the legal market combined with the illicit market is simply staggering. And so it makes sense that companies try to supply both of those markets.
Right. And what do you make of the industry argument then that if you increase the sin taxes on tobacco, what you're doing is you're encouraging the illicit market? I mean, that's an argument that one regularly hears.
Well, so I'm a bit of an odd tobacco control activist, if you want to call me that. So tobacco control activists typically tend to argue that increasing tax rates would result in an increase in illicit trade. And there certainly seems to be some evidence that that could potentially be the case. But having said that, what we've started seeing the world over is that illicit trade penetration rates tend to come from estimates that are done by the tobacco industry itself. And so what's been happening is that the tobacco companies have an interest in inflating the illicit trade penetration rates or prevalence rates in a particular country, because if they can argue that the illicit penetration rate is really high, then they have an argument that government shouldn't be increasing the tax rates. And tobacco companies have an interest in not having tobacco tax rates increased for the very simple reason that if you increase the tax rates, consumers are less likely to buy your product. And so we see study after study that shows how tobacco companies inflate the prevalence to say that taxes shouldn't be increased because that will likely lead to an increase in illicit prevalence. What we see instead is that it really is a factor of the strength of enforcement. So the actual price and the actual tax rate ends up not being the most significant determinant, but it's actually the strength of enforcement that gives you an indication of how big the illicit trade penetration rate would be.
Right. Yes, I was quite flabbergasted to read in your book where you actually say that, in fact, the most of the increase in the price of cigarettes in South Africa, I think in the 1990s, if I can find it here, was actually increased by the tobacco company and was not a case of tax. You say between 1990s and 2000s in South Africa, for every 10 cents, government increased the tax on a pack of cigarettes, by the retail price increased by 18 cents, an extra 8 cents, pure profit. The companies were making almost as much money off the tax rate increases as the government was. So that would seem to support your argument. The other also thing which I think people will be fascinated by is this this business of Botswana, where there's just not a correlation. Yeah. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, yeah.
On Botswana?
The Botswana angle? So Botswana is interesting, and I subsequently did. So Botswana is very interesting, and I subsequently did a similar analysis on our trade volumes with Zimbabwe. So with both of those countries, if you look at a cigarette export, say from South Africa to Zimbabwe or to Botswana, what we know is that What's in the container should obviously match the export declaration in South Africa, and that should match the import declaration on the Botswana side or on the Zimbabwe side. But in fact, that isn't happening. So if you look at the data from Zimbabwe, which I just recently looked at, when we look at the exports that are declared from South Africa, 66% of exports from South Africa are going missing and do not reach their destination market. So specifically for cigarette exports. So what seems to be happening is that South African manufacturers are declaring tobacco for export to other countries in Africa generally. And 66% of those declared export consignments are never declared as having been imported in the destination country. So 66% of cigarette consignments seem to be going missing between South Africa and the countries that they're meant to be exported to. And this is an important indicator because when you export a consignment of cigarettes, of course, the South African taxes and duties aren't payable on those consignments. And so if you can pretend to be exporting consignments of cigarettes, but in fact keep them on the local market instead of actually exporting them, what it means is that you can sell those cigarettes tax-free and duty-free. And so, yeah, 66% of our exports seem to be going missing and never reach the declared destination country.
Mm. And what is the tax implication of that for South Africa?
I've actually just recently started talking to somebody in terms of doing actual calculations on the implications of the missing exports. So I can't give you a figure in terms of what the exports are costing us, but it would certainly be more than the amount that we are losing. So the 1.6 billion that we're losing per month to the illicit trade at the moment. Right.
And what I was also interested is, I mean, we know other people have written about this. Johan van Lochrenberg, who features in your book as well. And you also mentioned the revelations in Jacques Poe's book. I wonder if you could just talk about, there are two aspects here in terms of how the trade is controlled and maybe why the issues you raise are not addressed. The one is media manipulation or manipulation of us as journalists in terms of what message gets out and how we understand the issues. And the other one appears to be political influence. I wonder if we can start with the media. You write in your book that after SARS had announced that it was going to put out a tender for the traceability solution to mark cigarette packs, after 12 years of promises to do so, in the space of less than 6 months, no less than 22 directly related articles appeared in the media. Of those, only 3% argued in favor of a secure marking solution. The rest all advanced an industry line that sought to delay, derail, or dilute SARS's efforts. Can we talk a little bit about how that message gets out and how companies try to manipulate the press, and you seem to think they're quite successful at it?
Well, so I think if you go back a number of years and you look at all of the industry documents we have, so internal industry documents from the tobacco industry, one of the things we see is that they've been very strongly advised by public relations companies. And so most of the work that they've been doing in recent years over the past decade or so has really focused on strong public relations campaigns. Now, we know that the tobacco companies can't advertise like they used to in the past. So what they've instead started doing, I think really strongly, is one of a few things. The first one is that they have made quite strong inroads in terms of how they use editorial content in the media. So they influence the arguments and the rhetoric and, dare I say, the propaganda that we see in a lot of the editorial content in the media. And at the same time, what they're really masterful at is, there's a very nice quote from one of the public relations campaigns that says, it doesn't matter what your argument is as a tobacco company, people won't trust you and they won't believe your messaging simply because of who you are. And so all of their PR companies have been advising them, put your message in somebody else's mouth, have somebody else share your rhetoric, have somebody else share your messaging, because other sources of information relating to your business are likely to be viewed as more trustworthy than, information coming from a tobacco company itself. And so, you won't necessarily see a British American Tobacco or one of the other big companies publicly commenting on a lot of the events that are happening. They might not necessarily publicly directly comment on the track and trace tender that SARS issued, because they've really, I think, mastered the art of using proxies to do a lot of the content that we see in the media. And so again, it's a trend we see globally, and it's a trend where we see the tobacco companies being really masterful at controlling media rhetoric through editorial content or through feeding information to journalists. And because they're a good source of information, number one, but also I think because we tend to view large listed companies as potentially better sources of information than maybe, some fly-by-night small low-cost manufacturer, I think both the media and the consumers run the risk of assuming that these guys have our best interests at heart. So what they've created is really an environment which sets the big tobacco companies up as the good guys, and that sets them up as potential partners for government. So we want to partner with government to tackle illicit trade. And so it's natural, I think, for both journalists and for consumers to have sympathy for the big tobacco companies. And so it makes it easy for us to buy rhetoric that is pro big tobacco companies. And yeah, so I think when you start looking at media articles, it's really interesting to see the extent to which it is definitely pro big tobacco rhetoric, and does not necessarily reflect many of the views that we see come from maybe other more objective research.
Right. Now, one of the things you mentioned there was you said that the tobacco company's information is quite good. But there's a reason for this, which is rather sinister, because you say that tobacco companies have been involved with the security services. And I think now we need to go onto the really biggie one for us today, discussion point. And that is, you say that it's because of the influence of tobacco and fighting that, which really lit the fuse, which led to the demise of SARS, and also the rogue unit allegations, and that you really see tobacco as having played an incredibly large role because of its nexus with politics and the security forces, as having brought down our major institution.
So initially, when I started writing the book, I was very worried about including the South African angle, because I was worried that I wouldn't be able to do the story justice. But it became very apparent that it wasn't possible to tell the story of big tobacco without including what happened in South Africa. So I think there's ample evidence to support an informed contention that suggests that big tobacco, together with some of their political patronage partners, were very much involved in the demise of SARS, were very much behind the creation of this whole rogue unit narrative. And I think if there's a single entity at whose door we should lie the whole rogue unit narrative, it is with big tobacco. So look, the very short version is this. we know that Belinda Walter, an attorney, was working for Carnalinks as their lawyer. She was also the chairperson of FITA, the industry association for the smaller independent manufacturers. But at the same time, we know for a fact that she was also acting as an agent for British American Tobacco, spying on her clients. And we also know for a fact that she was an agent for the State Security Agency. So during the course of her dealings, she obviously came into contact with a number of pieces of evidence which she had access to that showed that there was clear criminality on the part of entities in British American Tobacco, individuals employed by the State Security Agency, individuals employed by the security company that was hired by BAT. So she had all of this evidence at her disposal because she was really in the middle of the action. So we know at some point she started dating Johan van Lochrenberg, and during the course of this relationship, I think she must have felt under pressure because she was simply representing so many parties with what is really only criminal intent. And so she disclosed that she had all of this evidence at her disposal that, was really detrimental to people, I think, in British American Tobacco, State Security Agency, and the security company hired by BAT. So she made this evidence available to Johan van Lochrenberg. And then shortly after that, we know that their relationship ended. Around the same time, she seems to have realized that she had exposed herself to potential criminal charges herself because she had been involved in money laundering. She had, I think, breached a number of obligations that rests on a lawyer. So she realized that she had exposed herself to criminal charges herself. So she went back to her handlers at BAT and the State Security Agency, and they tried to figure out a way to give her some sense of comfort that the work that she had done for them would not result in criminal charges being brought against her. So as part of this, they offered to help her get indemnity, which is a different conversation because it's technically legally impossible for them to have offered her indemnity, be it as it may. So as part of her engagement then with the State Security Agency and her handlers at BAT, they realized that Johan van Lochrenberg still had all of this incriminating evidence. So they somehow needed to discredit the evidence that Johan had implicating BAT, FSS, and the State Security Agency individuals. And so what they realized is that in terms of law, if you got information illegally, then you can't, generally speaking, use that evidence in subsequent law proceedings. So they figured out that if they could somehow suggest that Johan and or SARS somehow had obtained this evidence against BAT and FSS and the State Security Agency agents, if that evidence had been obtained illegally, then no legal action could be taken off the back of that evidence. And so between them, they came up with a plan that suggested, well, actually, Belinda Walter never handed this evidence over to Johan willingly. The evidence was obtained through having been intercepted because SARS ran this very sophisticated unit in the back rooms that could intercept taxpayers' communications, which is absolute nonsense. But so in their effort to discredit the evidence that Belinda Walter had willingly handed over to Johan van Lochrenberg, they had to set up some kind of scheme that suggested that actually all of this evidence had been intercepted so that it couldn't be used in subsequent legal proceedings. And that is where the rogue unit narrative was born. Brent, you managed to mute yourself. I can't hear you.
I see. I'm just reminding all the people out there that you can place your questions now, and we
Okay.
will be able to take them. A number of people are asking about what do you think of the ban on the COVID-19 pandemic at the moment of no tobacco sales at all, and is there something sinister in that? Asks Donald Presley. Telita?
Well, okay. So in terms of the ban, okay. So let's first start with what I think about the ban itself. Under the Disaster Management Act, the minister had very specific powers when it comes to, for instance, limiting and regulating the manufacture and sale and distribution of alcohol products. She doesn't have similar powers, explicit powers, under the Disaster Management Act when it comes to tobacco products. And so it implies that what she has is a discretionary power. And I think when it comes to exercising a discretionary power, the bar should be set quite high in terms of making sure that relevant factors were considered. And when you then start turning it into a slightly more constitutional argument, our government needs to make rational decisions that are rationally aligned with the objective that they are trying to achieve. And considering the amount of evidence that the minister had at her disposal at the time when the ban was introduced, I am convinced that it shouldn't pass constitutional muster. I think that government overstepped the bounds of rationality in terms of the ban. And so related to that, I think whenever any government introduces any kind of regulation, there has to be some consideration for unintended consequences. And so when we look at the revenue loss and at the fact that our police service now seems to be inundated chasing, people who are buying cigarettes illegally, I think the consequences have been so significant that it clearly wasn't a wise regulatory choice. I don't think it's an option that government ever should have pursued. I don't think the evidence was strong enough at the point where it was considered. I don't think the evidence is strong enough today. And even if it was, I believe that the economic harm compared to the supposed benefit is of such a nature that government should reverse its decision. In terms of the question of whether there are, ulterior motives and whether perhaps, the minister is somehow benefiting or donors of the minister are somehow benefiting from the ban, I think it's an easy argument to make, and I can certainly see why, looking at it from the outside, it's an easy conclusion to come to. But there's absolutely no evidence. What we have are two photos of a cigarette manufacturer posing with the minister. We know that he donated, caps and some clothing to one of her campaigns. But there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever, firstly, that someone like Adriana Mazzotti, has some kind of deal with the minister. And also, in the social media, we see a lot of comments around Edward Zuma being involved in the manufacturing of cigarettes. But his directorship with that company ended many years ago. It's possible that he's still a silent partner and that he is in some way still benefiting from the cigarette trade. But certainly on paper, Edward Zuma hasn't been involved in the cigarette business for many, many years. And so I think, it adds to the drama, and it's nice to suggest that perhaps there's something nefarious going on, but I don't think it's borne out by the facts.
Okay. We have a question from Jarita Kasson, who's asked it a second time. If we could have a look at that. Who does the largest share of the illicit cigarette market? Which country, or is it through local companies, as discussed? Do you have an answer on that?
Yes. So historically, traditionally, if we go back a few years, we know that around 57% of the illicit market in South Africa came from products that were smuggled from Zimbabwe. So historically, the majority of our illicit cigarettes most likely came from Zimbabwe. But what we've seen in recent years is that this balance has actually shifted. So we have two data points that we can consider. The one data point is one that British American Tobacco itself actually came up with the assistance of their security company that they had hired. So we know that of the smaller low-cost manufacturers, it certainly seems that their role in terms of supplying the illicit market could potentially be on the increase, simply based on, you know, some of the data we see. So I know at some point, some of the BAT and FSS documents suggested that Gold Leaf Tobacco was the company driving most of this. But of course, they would have an interest in, you know, having their own numbers. But more recently, Professor Corné van Walbeek from Cape Town did that study into, you know, what the illicit market looks like after the lockdown. And what we see is, based on the research that, used a survey speaking to, I think, 16,000 smokers, we see that a lot of the current illicit market seems to be driven by products that appear to have come from gold leaf tobacco manufacturing. I think, again, when you look at social media and even mainstream media, everyone loves talking about Adriano Mazzotti and Carnalinks. But when you look at the data, it seems like his company is actually, in the bigger scheme of things, a fairly small player when it comes to supplying the illicit market. And so right now, it seems that there's certainly still a supply line from Zimbabwe. There's definitely a local supply line. But I think what really was interesting when you look at Corné van Walbeek's data is that 25% of the current local illicit market seems to have come from a big company like British American Tobacco. And so I think that needs to start changing some of the paradigms and some of the discussions we have around who is really driving illicit trade. And I think begin to have conversations that acknowledge the illicit trade isn't only being driven by small, low-cost manufacturers, but that historically and traditionally, the big tobacco companies have just as much been involved in supplying illicit markets.
Then we have a question from Sarah Sonnenberg. Do you know about the tax stamp track and trace tender, which was postponed? We mentioned earlier about all the articles. But...
So, I mean, yes. So the current control paradigm that SARS has in place uses it's called a diamond stamp. It's a simple imprint on the bottom of a cigarette pack. So in 2007, SARS indicated that they wanted to replace this diamond stamp because it's absolutely meaningless. You know, you could literally print a fake copy of the stamp in your garage over the weekend. So since 2007, SARS has been indicating that they want to introduce more rigorous controls. And most of this relates to the introduction of a tax stamp. So a tax stamp is really thing that you stick over a cigarette pack. I can show you an example if you just bear with me. So it's really a thing like this that you stick over a cigarette pack that shows that tax has been paid on it. And so if I'm a customs officer or a police officer, I can easily see whether tax has been paid on a particular pack. But also I can take that pack and I can trace it back to the particular manufacturer who made it. It's a very useful thing to have. So during the course of 2019, SARS finally published a tender inviting companies to provide this kind of tax stamp and traceability solution. And why it was cancelled, I think there are many factors that potentially played into it. So the first one is, we know that when the tender was issued, FITA, representing the smaller low-cost manufacturers, were actually in favor of introducing it. So the small low-cost guys were saying, we're happy for SARS to introduce a traceability solution. British American Tobacco and TISA, representing the big tobacco companies, were very vocally opposed to SARS introducing a traceability solution. And that already has my dogs barking. You know, why would a big company oppose a system that could clamp down on illicit trade? So at the time, British American Tobacco and TISA made a number of statements. So for instance, they said, we think that SARS isn't capable of introducing sophisticated IT systems. Well, you know, for the longest time, SARS had one of the most efficient IT departments. I think saying that they're not capable of introducing large-scale IT projects is simply bizarre. And they said it's a lot of money to waste. Well, if you consider how much money SARS is losing, the country is losing to illicit tobacco, it actually wouldn't have cost that much to introduce a traceability scheme like this. Ultimately, I suspect that at least one of the reasons why the tender was cancelled was maybe from an abundance of caution. So the tender was initially published while Tom Moyane was still commissioner. And I think Edward Kieswetter, the new commissioner, is a fairly cautious man. I think he would have wanted to make sure that any tenders that had been issued while Tom Moyane was commissioner, you know, that there weren't any gremlins hiding in there that could actually come back to bite SARS at a later stage. So, you know, me purely speculating, I suspect one of the factors that may have played into it might be the new SARS Commissioner Kieswetter trying to simply be overly cautious and hopefully, you know, reintroduce some kind of traceability project, hopefully at some point in the future. But that's me giving SARS the benefit of the doubt. You know, it's also entirely possible that SARS simply bowed to industry pressure and decided to walk away from the traceability project.
Right. We have a question from Kunrad de Beer. He wants to know about the Zonda Commission, and he's not the only one. Given all the revelations and everything that you've put in your book, and other people have published around the industry, are we going to see something at the Zonda? And if not, why not? I think we have a delay. Go ahead on Zonda Commission.
I would love to see issues like this being raised at the Zonda Commission. You know, when you look at yes, so sorry, I lost you there. So I would love to see this featured at something like the Zonda Commission. When you look at what happened in South Africa, there is ample evidence that shows the extent of capture in South Africa by the industry itself. You know, and this is true, I think, for elements in SARS. It's true, definitely, for elements in the police force, the police service. It's definitely true for a number of elements at the State Security Agency. It should form part of what we discuss at forums like Zondo. And I certainly hope that it does, because it has cost our country so much. And again, you know, it's about more than just the money we lose. It's about the fact that the industry played an active role in destroying an organization that I think we were all extremely proud of. You know, and it almost made it bearable to pay tax. So it's about more than just capture at SARS. It's about capture across a broad spectrum of government agencies.
We have a question about the pension funds. I think, if I'm correct, Telita, I think you do say in your book that it's about 30 billion rand that the PIC, the Public Investment Corporation, which has our public servants' pensions, actually has invested in shares in the industry. Can you talk about that? Is that correct? And what are the implications of that?
Absolutely. So towards the end of my kind of efforts in writing the book, I was trying to understand why big tobacco companies, despite having a very extensive history of criminality, why they keep getting away with it. And so I was speaking to some of the people who are actually doing the European Fraud Office investigation into BAT at the moment. And one of the things they mentioned is that perhaps big tobacco is simply too big to fail. So I tried to draw that comment back to South Africa. And indeed, the South African, the Government Employees Fund effectively invests 30 billion rand in British American tobacco. So you have to wonder, with that much money at stake, how brave would a criminal investigator be to take on a big company like that? So one of the things that gives me a little bit of hope is on a slightly more international scale, we know that there's a big move for consumers, for people like ourselves, to divest from tobacco stocks, but it means that you have to really take a strong moral position, because we know that the tobacco companies are performing extremely well on stock exchanges today still. So there's definitely globally a move to get more people to divest from tobacco stocks. In South Africa, I don't see that happening any day soon. But if British American Tobacco were properly taken to task for at least some of the evidence that we've seen implicating them in questionable dealings, the Government Employees Pension Fund certainly stands to lose significantly.
Right. Then we have a question from Anthony Butler, who's wondering, we talk about, there's also people talk about big pharma, people talk about big all kinds of things, and big tobacco. Why are you specific about tobacco, and why do you see them as perhaps being more insidious than the others? Why are you picking on them? Go ahead.
Right. I don't necessarily see them as more insidious than the others. I suspect that the behaviors we see from big tobacco companies are the kind of behaviors that we see in all of these types of industries. Bottom line is, I didn't choose this book. The book chose me. So, I was actually doing some research on supply chain security, generally speaking. And I happened to read an article about how British American Tobacco in particular was smuggling their products into China. And I just thought it was the most astonishing story, how a listed multinational company could be smuggling their product, and so openly and so well documented. I think for me, that was the most astonishing thing, is that a big company like this was literally documenting their strategy, documenting minutes of meetings in terms of how they were smuggling. So I didn't mean to set out making big tobacco the big bad wolf. But it was just a story that suggested itself. And I am fairly confident that you could write the same story for big pharma. You could probably write the same story for sugar. And so, maybe that'll be the next book. So it was never meant initially to target big tobacco. It was a curiosity to me, because it was so obvious, again, that other businesses can secure their supply chains, but big tobacco says that it can't do so itself. And so, so that's why I wrote something about big tobacco.
Thank you, Telita. I think we've run through most of the questions, and it was experimental. We had a couple of hiccups, but we are doing this from opposite sides of the earth. but we'd like to thank you very much for joining us all the way from Singapore. And it's very strange talking to a screen and not having a live audience. And I hope we'll revert to our new event, our regular events in the near future. But I think this went quite well for today. And we look forward to welcoming everybody back again at the Cape Town Press Club with the other speakers that we're going to have. And we shall get better at it, technology allowing. Thanks very much, Telita. I wish I could give you our present. Normally we have a little gift to give our speaker. We'll have to send you something electronic.
Perfect. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.
It'll have to wait